The sun dipped low behind the rows of identical suburban houses as Mark Collins pulled into his driveway. The place was pristine, freshly cut lawns, white picket fences, and an eerie kind of uniform perfection that made the neighborhood feel almost too good to be true. For most people, this would be the ideal place to settle down. But Mark wasn't most people. As an FBI special agent, he had spent years reading people, sensing when something wasn't right. And as he stepped out of his car, feeling the warmth of the pavement under his boots, he couldn't shake the feeling that this neighborhood was hiding something beneath its polished surface. A sharp bark cut through the silence. Max, his German shepherd, leapt from the passenger seat, his tail wagging excitedly. The dog had been his partner in every way, loyal, protective, and sharp as a blade. If there was something off about this place, Mark knew Max would sense it first. At first, everything seemed normal. The neighbors waved politely, smiling just a little too perfectly as Mark unpacked boxes from his truck. The HOA president, Richard Lawson, even stopped by to introduce himself. A middle-aged man in a crisp polo shirt, his handshake firm but calculated. "We keep things in order around here," Richard had said, his eyes briefly flickering toward Max. "I trust you'll follow the rules." Mark had smiled, but he didn't miss the warning buried beneath those words. Days passed, and life in the neighborhood remained uneventful, almost too uneventful. There were no kids playing outside, no barking dogs, no signs of life beyond the occasional whispering neighbors who seemed to watch his every move. It was the kind of place where everyone pretended to be friendly, but no one ever said what they were really thinking. Max, however, wasn't fooled. The dog had always been a good judge of character, and lately he had been restless. More than once he stood by the window, ears perked, growling at something, someone unseen. Then came the little things. One evening, Mark found his trash cans overturned, though he was sure they had been secure. A day later, his mailbox was left open, letters scattered on the ground as if someone had been snooping. At first he dismissed it as coincidence, until he noticed the pattern. Each time Max had reacted first, his protective instincts flaring up just before something strange happened. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. Then one morning, an official-looking letter appeared on Mark's doorstep. It was from the HOA, printed on heavy paper, with a seal at the bottom, a level of formality that felt almost ridiculous. Mark unfolded it, scanning the words, his jaw tightening as he read. "Your dog is a problem. You are in violation of HOA Regulation 17B regarding dangerous breeds. Immediate compliance is required." His eyes narrowed. Dangerous breed. Max had been trained alongside law enforcement. He was disciplined, obedient, far from a danger. Mark glanced toward the street, and that's when he noticed it. Across the road, a group of neighbors stood in their driveways, watching him. They weren't just curious, they were waiting to see what he would do next. Something was wrong with this place, and Mark was about to find out just how deep the rot ran. Mark studied the letter in his hands, his eyes scanning over the cold, bureaucratic wording. The HOA had been quick. He had barely been in the neighborhood a week, and they were already coming after Max. "Your dog is a problem." The words lingered, bold and absolute. The letter continued, citing Regulation 17B, which apparently prohibited dangerous breeds from residing in the community. It didn't name specific breeds, but Mark knew exactly what they meant. Max was a German shepherd, a working dog, a protector, and for some reason that made people nervous. Mark exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He had encountered bureaucratic power plays before, people who hid behind rules to get what they wanted. But something about this felt different, more personal. Later that afternoon, a knock at the door pulled Mark from his thoughts. He opened it to find Richard Lawson, the HOA president, standing there in his usual polished polo shirt and khaki slacks, flanked by two other board members, a wiry woman with thin-rimmed glasses and a bald man with an uncomfortably forced smile. Richard held up a clipboard, his expression unreadable. "I assume you got the letter," he said, his tone more of a statement than a question. Mark folded his arms. "I did, and I have some questions." The woman, who Mark now recognized as Linda Schaefer, the HOA secretary, adjusted her glasses and let out a breath like she was already annoyed. "There's not much to discuss, Mr. Collins. It's a clear violation. Your dog falls under the dangerous breed category. We have rules in place for the safety of all residents." Mark's grip on the door tightened. "Max is a trained service animal. He's worked alongside law enforcement. He's not a danger to anyone unless they have something to hide." Richard's smile thinned, but he didn't react. Instead, he flipped through the pages on his clipboard before looking up again. "I understand you worked in law enforcement, Mark, and I respect that. But we have to enforce the rules fairly. If we make an exception for you, we have to make one for everyone." Mark held his gaze. Something about Richard's tone set off an instinctual warning in his gut. This wasn't just about a rule. It was about control. "I'm not removing my dog," Mark said finally, his voice level but firm. "He stays." For the first time, Richard's carefully constructed mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second. His eyes darkened, his fingers tightening around the clipboard. But before he could speak, Linda stepped in. "Then you'll be fined." Mark exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Fine me all you want. I'll fight it." Richard's forced smile returned, but there was something calculating behind it now. "That's your right. But I'd be careful, Mark. We take community harmony very seriously here." With that, he handed over an official violation notice, neatly printed and signed, as if this were just another mundane matter of paperwork. Then, with a curt nod, the three of them turned and walked back down the driveway. Mark watched them go, his fingers curling around the notice. He knew what had just happened. This wasn't a request. It was a warning. From the doorway, Max let out a low growl, his ears pricked forward, watching the HOA members disappear down the street. Mark reached down, running a hand over the dog's head. "Yeah," he murmured. "I don't trust them either." That night, Mark found a new fine taped to his door, this time for improper trash bin placement, even though he had followed the HOA guidelines exactly. The next morning, someone had left a complaint about noise disturbances, though Mark hadn't made a sound. The day after that, his lawn was reported for being 1 inch too high, a laughable offense, given that it had just been mowed. One by one, the fines stacked up. At first, Mark was frustrated. Then he started to pay closer attention. A pattern emerged. The fines didn't just come from the HOA itself. Several neighbors, ones who had seemed neutral before, were suddenly filing complaints. Someone had rallied them. Someone had turned them against him. Max sensed the shift too. He had become even more alert, more on edge. One evening, as Mark sat on his porch, he watched as Max's ears snapped toward the bushes across the street, his body stiffening. Mark followed his gaze, and that's when he saw it. A silhouette, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting, and then, just as quickly as he noticed it, it disappeared. Mark's fingers curled around the armrest of his chair. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was something else entirely. And Mark wasn't about to let them win. Mark had dealt with intimidation tactics before, but not like this. The first incident seemed harmless enough. His trash cans overturned. Garbage scattered like an animal had been rummaging through it. But something felt off. When he checked his security cameras, the footage was gone. The feed had mysteriously cut out at midnight and resumed just before dawn. That was the first red flag. Then came the fines, piling up like someone was personally targeting him. A parking violation for being an inch over the line. A noise complaint when he hadn't made a sound. A lawn maintenance warning, even though his grass was perfectly trimmed. At first, Mark dismissed them as random annoyances, until he noticed the pattern. Each fine, warning, and violation coincided with nights when his security cameras failed. That's when Mark knew this wasn't just bad luck. Someone was tampering with his system. One night, determined to catch them in the act, he installed a backup camera system, completely separate from the HOA's power grid. 2 nights later, his main cameras cut out again. Mark checked his backup feed the next morning, expecting to finally have proof. Instead, his stomach dropped. The files were corrupted. Someone had anticipated his move. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing games. They were calculated, experienced, and they wanted him gone. Mark knew exactly who to watch. Richard Lawson. The HOA president wasn't just enforcing rules, he was orchestrating something bigger. Late one evening, Mark took Max for a walk, keeping to the darker side of the street. That's when he saw them. Richard stood in a dimly lit driveway, speaking in low tones with 2 other board members. Mark slowed his pace, listening carefully. Richard's voice was sharp, controlled. "He's not backing down. We'll make things uncomfortable. He'll leave eventually." Mark's jaw tightened. They were coordinating. Against him. But why? Why was a dog such a threat to them? Mark didn't have to wait long for his answer. The next morning he stepped onto his porch to find a thick smear of mud across his front door, and a note shoved under the mat. It was typed, with no signature. "Not worth the fight. Leave." Mark's grip tightened around the paper, anger rising. But when he checked his backup footage, his stomach sank again. The files were gone. That afternoon, Mark stormed into the HOA office, the note clenched in his fist. Richard Lawson sat behind his polished mahogany desk, sipping coffee like he didn't have a care in the world. Mark slammed the note onto the desk. "I assume you know something about this?" Richard didn't even blink. He barely glanced at the paper before leaning back in his chair, a calm, unreadable expression on his face. "Mark," he said smoothly, "I don't know what kind of paranoia your job has left you with, but we don't do threats here." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Then explain why my security system keeps failing, and why every time it does, something happens?" Richard let out a theatrical sigh, rubbing his temples like he was dealing with a child's tantrum. "Technology is unpredictable," he said casually. "Maybe you should get a better system. A challenge. A taunt." Mark studied him, searching for a crack in the armor. Richard met his gaze with that same smug smile, the kind that said, "You can't prove a thing." Mark's fingers curled into a fist at his side. For now, Richard had the upper hand, but Mark had spent years in the FBI. He knew how to play the long game, and he wasn't about to let this go. Mark had spent years hunting criminals, dismantling organized networks, and exposing hidden agendas. He wasn't about to let a homeowners association outmaneuver him. It was time to dig deeper. Most people saw the HOA board as nothing more than a group of busybodies, obsessed with grass height and parking rules. But Mark had learned that power, no matter how small, always attracts corruption. The real question was, what were they hiding? He started with the HOA's financial records, something most residents never bothered to check. Using his credentials, he accessed public filings and HOA budget reports. At first glance, everything seemed standard. Maintenance costs, landscaping fees, community projects. But the numbers didn't add up. Thousands of dollars were being allocated to contractors who didn't exist. Payments were being funneled through a shell company registered under an unfamiliar name, RL Holdings, LLC. Mark's pulse quickened. RL. Richard Lawson. That smug, self-righteous HOA president wasn't just enforcing rules. He was running a financial scam right under the noses of the homeowners. And now, Mark had found the thread that could unravel it all. Late that night, as Mark sat at his desk, reviewing financial documents, Max suddenly stiffened. His ears perked. His body went rigid. Then a low growl rumbled from his throat. Mark's head snapped up. Max was staring at the window, his eyes locked onto something in the darkness outside. Mark reached for his gun. Heart pounding, he moved toward the blinds, carefully peeking through the slats. A shadow. Someone was standing at the edge of his yard, motionless. Mark's grip tightened on the handle of his pistol. He took a slow breath, then threw open the door. But the figure was already gone. Max lunged forward, barking furiously, his tail stiff, hackles raised. Mark scanned the street, but there was no sign of movement. Just the distant hum of streetlights and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Whoever had been watching was careful, calculated, silent, and that meant one thing. They weren't just there to scare him. They were there to send a message. Mark didn't sleep that night. He sat in his living room, gun on the coffee table, reviewing everything he had found. At 6 a.m., as the neighborhood started waking up, he stepped outside to grab the newspaper, and froze. His front porch light was shattered. Tiny shards of glass sparkled under the rising sun. A subtle warning, just enough to say, "We know you're looking," but not enough to prove who did it. Mark let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. They wanted him paranoid, second-guessing himself, wondering if he was overreacting, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, Mark found something new in his mailbox. A final HOA warning, stating that if he didn't remove Max from the neighborhood, within 48 hours, legal action would be taken. But this time, it wasn't signed by Richard Lawson. It was signed by RL Holdings, LLC. Mark's breath hitched. The same shell company from the financial records. Everything was connected. This wasn't about a dog at all. This was about power, money, and control. And Mark had just become their biggest problem. Mark had been in plenty of tight situations before. He'd faced down criminals, negotiated with dangerous informants, and walked into ambushes with only seconds to react. But nothing prepared him for the sight of flashing red and blue lights outside his house. This time, the target wasn't some high-profile criminal. It was him. The knock came at 6:15 a.m., sharp and deliberate, the kind that meant business. Mark barely had time to grab his gun before a voice boomed from outside. "FBI Special Agent Mark Collins, we need you to step outside." He opened the door to 3 uniformed officers, hands resting near their holsters. Behind them, a familiar figure stood in a pressed suit. Detective Ryan Carter. Mark had worked with him before. Tough, by the book, and not easily fooled. But today, his expression was unreadable. "What's going on?" Mark asked, keeping his voice steady. Carter exhaled. "We got a report, a serious one. Someone filed a complaint saying you made violent threats against the HOA board." Mark's jaw tightened. "That's ridiculous." Carter didn't flinch. "We also received an anonymous tip, with evidence." One of the officers handed Mark a plastic bag. Inside was a printed email, supposedly sent from his personal address. It was a direct threat. The kind that could end a career, or worse, put him behind bars. Mark scanned the email quickly. "If you don't back off, I'll make sure you regret it. You'll wish you never set foot in this neighborhood." It was perfectly worded, just enough aggression to sound credible, just enough ambiguity to be dangerous. Mark felt the trap closing in. Mark had been in law enforcement long enough to know how this worked. A claim like this, especially with so-called evidence, could wreck his career. Carter's voice was calm but firm. "Mark, you know the drill. We need you to come in for questioning." Mark met his gaze. "And if I don't?" Carter sighed. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The officers were waiting. Their hands hadn't moved, but Mark could see it in their eyes. They were ready to escalate if he so much as twitched the wrong way. He took a slow breath, then nodded. "Let me grab my jacket." As he turned, his eyes flickered to Max, who stood at attention by the door. The dog knew something was wrong. Good, because Mark had a feeling this was just the beginning. Hours later, he sat in a cold, gray interrogation room at the precinct. No handcuffs, no arrest, just an informal conversation. But he knew better. They questioned him for over an hour. His movements, his emails, his interactions with the HOA. He answered everything with precision, but the uneasy feeling in his gut only grew. Someone had gone to great lengths to set him up. And then came the final blow. Carter slid a folder across the table. "The Bureau has been notified. You're on temporary leave until this is resolved." Mark stared at the words, "Suspension pending investigation," stamped across the paperwork. No badge, no resources, no backup, just him and the people trying to destroy him. Mark stepped out of the precinct into the cold morning air. His fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't just about making him uncomfortable anymore. This was about taking him off the board completely. A tactical move. Remove his authority. Make him vulnerable. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare him. They were trying to break him, and Mark wasn't about to let that happen. Mark had spent his entire career hunting criminals, peeling back layers of deception until he reached the truth. But this time, the criminals weren't in some underground syndicate or drug cartel. They were sitting in neatly manicured suburban homes, running a homeowners association, and they had just tried to destroy him after his suspension. Mark had nothing but time, and he put it to good use. With no access to FBI databases, he had to dig the old-fashioned way. Public records, business filings, court documents buried under layers of legal jargon. It took days, but finally a pattern emerged. Alan Whitmore, the HOA president, wasn't just a controlling bureaucrat obsessed with lawn heights and property values. 15 years ago he had a different name. Alan Westcott, a name linked to multiple fraud cases. Shell companies, money laundering. The charges had mysteriously vanished before trial. Mark leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. "You son of a—" Whitmore hadn't reformed. He'd just gotten smarter. And now he was running an entire neighborhood as a front. Mark mapped out the financial records he'd uncovered. Inflated HOA fees. Suspicious renovation expenses. Missing funds. The HOA wasn't just about petty power trips. It was a multi-million-dollar fraud operation. They were laundering money through fake maintenance projects, bogus security fees, and phantom businesses. And Mark had walked straight into it when he refused to back down. That's why they wanted him gone. Mark knew he needed proof, something undeniable. He reached out to Hector Ramirez, a former HOA treasurer who had resigned abruptly 6 months ago. The man had access to years of financial records. They arranged to meet in a quiet diner outside the city limits, but Hector never showed. Mark called, straight, to voicemail. Then an anonymous text popped up on his screen. "Drop it, agent. Walk away while you still can." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. They weren't just playing legal games anymore. This was a warning. Mark tightened his grip on the phone. If Hector was in trouble, he had to move fast. He traced the man's last known address and drove out, Max in the passenger seat, eyes sharp. But when he arrived, the apartment was ransacked. Hector was gone. No signs of a struggle. Just a deliberate cleanup. Mark's gut twisted. He was too late. Whoever was behind this wasn't just stealing money anymore. They were willing to make people disappear. A sound outside. Mark's instincts kicked in. He reached for his gun, eyes scanning the parking lot. Then he saw it. A black SUV idling down the block, tinted windows. No plates. They were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Mark exhaled slowly, forcing his heartbeat to steady. He wasn't just investigating a scam anymore. He was in the middle of something bigger. And if he didn't act fast, he'd be the next one to disappear. Mark knew he couldn't take them down with gut feelings and circumstantial evidence. He needed something airtight, proof so damning that even the most corrupt officials couldn't ignore it. And thanks to his FBI training, he knew exactly how to get it. For 2 nights, Mark worked in the shadows, scanning old financial records, decrypted emails, and security footage from around the neighborhood. At first, it was just a jumble of numbers, invoices, and fake company names. But then, he found it. $250,000 bank transfer, wired directly to a shell company linked to Alan Whitmore. The memo read, "Emergency HOA Reserve Fund Allocation." That was it. Proof of embezzlement. But he needed more. Whitmore was too smart to leave his fingerprints on everything. If Mark wanted to bring him down for good, he needed the man to incriminate himself. Mark sent an email early the next morning. "Let's talk. No lawyers, just you and me." It was a risk, but it was the only way to force Whitmore's hand. An hour later, Mark sat at the HOA office, his phone secretly recording in his pocket. Whitmore strolled in with his usual smug expression, but there was an edge of caution in his eyes. He was hiding something, and he knew Mark had figured it out. "You've been causing quite the mess, Agent Collins," Whitmore said, lowering himself into the chair across from Mark. Mark smirked. "And you've been stealing quite a bit of money, Alan." A flicker of annoyance passed over Whitmore's face before he leaned back with a chuckle. "You don't have proof." Mark slid a thick file across the table. "Actually, I do. And soon, the police will too." For the briefest second, Whitmore paled. Then his mask of confidence returned. "You're making a mistake, Collins." His voice dropped, venom lacing his words. "You don't know who you're messing with." Mark let a slow smile spread across his face. Then he tapped his phone against the table. "Actually, I do. And thanks to you, I now have an audio confession." Whitmore's face drained of color. His eyes flicked to the file, then to the phone, calculating his way out. Then, without warning, he lunged. Mark barely had time to brace himself before Whitmore grabbed at his phone, sending it clattering across the desk. But Mark had been waiting for this moment. In one swift motion, he slammed Whitmore's wrist down, twisting him into a hold before shoving him back into his chair. "That was dumb," Mark said, retrieving his phone. "Now I have evidence of assault too," Whitmore panted, his face a mask of panic and rage. Then came the knock at the door. It swung open, revealing 2 uniformed officers, and behind them, an FBI agent Mark recognized from his old division. "Alan, Whitmore, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice." Whitmore barely had time to protest before they cuffed him. Mark exhaled, watching as the man who had tried to destroy his life was finally led away. Max, waiting outside, wagged his tail in approval. Mark scratched behind the dog's ears. "Told you we'd win, buddy." The neighborhood had never seen anything like it. For years, the HOA ruled with an iron fist, disguising their corruption under the guise of community order. They fined homeowners for minor infractions, enforced ridiculous rules, and kept a tight grip on power. But now, their empire was crumbling. Alan Whitmore, the once untouchable HOA president, sat in a holding cell, awaiting trial on charges that would keep him behind bars for a long time. But the fallout didn't stop there. As news of the embezzlement scandal spread, the other HOA board members scrambled to distance themselves. One by one, they resigned, each hoping to avoid legal consequences. But the damage was done. Residents, once too afraid to question the HOA's authority, demanded answers. Bank records were exposed. Homeowners realized they'd been paying inflated fees for years, funding Whitmore's lavish lifestyle. A town hall meeting was called, and for the first time, people spoke without fear. "Why did we let them control us for so long?" one homeowner muttered. "They made us feel powerless," another said. But now they weren't powerless anymore. A petition was drafted, and within days, the HOA was officially dissolved. The final act of defiance came when a group of residents tore down the HOA's official sign from the community clubhouse. Mark watched from his front porch, a fresh cup of coffee in his hand, as the symbol of the old regime came crashing down. A satisfying sight. Mark's FBI suspension was lifted within days. The moment Internal Affairs reviewed the case, they knew he'd been set up. His name was officially cleared and his position was reinstated. His superiors even offered an apology. But Mark didn't care about bureaucratic niceties. He cared about one thing: getting back to normal life. Well, that and one unexpected victory. It started as a joke. One neighbor put up a "Hero of the Neighborhood" sign in Mark's yard, with Max's face on it. Then another family stopped by with homemade dog treats. And before long, Max had become a local legend. Kids ran up to pet him. Families who had once given him suspicious glances now greeted him with smiles. The same people who once saw him as a threat now called him a protector. Max, of course, loved every second of it. And Mark? For the first time since he moved in, he finally felt like he belonged. One evening, as Mark was grilling in the backyard, a man approached the fence, an older gentleman, the same one who had originally filed the complaint about Max. Mark tensed, expecting another confrontation. Instead, the man sighed. "I was wrong about your dog," he admitted. Mark raised an eyebrow. "That so?" The man nodded. "Turns out we had a real problem in the neighborhood. And it wasn't Max." He reached into his pocket and tossed a small object over the fence. Mark caught it. A new dog tag, engraved with the words, "Neighborhood Watch." Mark chuckled. "Guess that makes it official." Max, sitting beside him, let out a happy bark. Justice was served. The neighborhood was free. And Max was exactly where he belonged. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.